Hello, this is Phoenix Starwater, Shop 11. I'm going to be talking about Tyr, the god of war and justice in Nordic mythology. The binding of Fenrir is considered one of the only accounts that we have of Tyr's character that really survives, but we know he was a very important god to the Germanic people. Fenrir was one of 3 children born to Loki and a giantess, the first being Hel, the goddess of death, and the third being Jormungand, the world snake. So Fenrir keeps daunting company in his siblings, and he was considered the most dangerous. The Asgards actually took him to live with them and be reared among them because of this. Tyr became his handler because no one else would take him on, basically. They were afraid of him. So Tyr raised him from a pup. And the gods and goddesses, fearing Fenrir, began a game. They started to put chains and ropes around him and hoping that they would bind him. And when they didn't, the gods and goddesses would clap, fearing his wrath. They said it's just a game to test his strength. When they failed, they sent to the dwarven kingdom for assistance, and the dwarves came up with Gleipnir. Gleipnir is a chain made of things that don't exist. A woman's beard, the sound of a cat's footprints. Things that are futile to fight against because they don't exist. When Fenrir saw this chain, when it was presented to him by the gods and goddesses, he said that he would only allow himself to be bound if one of them put their hand in his mouth. Tyr was the only one willing to step forward and actually do so. Tyr was, of course, his handler, as I've said, so it was a betrayal for Tyr to do so. The gods bound Fenrir. Tyr put his hand in Fenrir's mouth, and when Fenrir could not break the chain, Fenrir looked to Tyr to free him. And when Tyr refused, Fenrir took his hand. Tyr sacrificed his hand and his dignity to prevent Fenrir from devouring everything, is what the gods and goddesses were afraid of. Fenrir would devour the whole of everywhere, not just Midgard, Earth, or Asgard, where they dwelled, but everywhere. I think that speaks a lot to how we have to view leadership. Our leaders today are selfish. We know this, we all know this. They look to themselves before who they should be looking after, us. We have elected officials who have no sacrificial qualities. Tyr shows this brilliant ability to sacrifice himself for the greater good. Being a god of justice, he upheld the law in the gods and goddesses voting for Fenrir to be bound, even if he didn't agree with it. Fenrir was his charge. He bonded with this pup. He raised him, he cared for him, and he still did the right thing by binding him and by doing it himself. If our current leaders did a little bit more sacrificing, we probably would not be in some of the situations we're currently in today. We have to look at leadership as a sacrificial quality, not just something that people have. They have to earn it by what they're willing to do for others. Which leads me into my second point, doing the necessary thing. Tyr probably did not agree with this ruling, having raised Fenrir, having seen his quality, but he had to go along with it. He was at that time the king of the gods. Odin had fallen out of favor temporarily, and Tyr took his place. Tyr knew what sacrificing his hand would mean and sacrificing his word to Fenrir. Tyr was truth back then. The rune Tewaz is the Tyr rune. It's actually the T that we have today for the most part. And that literally translates to truth. Tyr sacrificed his truth, his greatest quality that he was known for in leadership, to uphold this law, whether or not he agreed with it. Again, look at the leaders that we have today. How many of them can we say don't bend the rules just a little bit to suit themselves? Tyr wasn't willing to do that. He upheld the law no matter what he felt. He was fair, and he was willing to do it himself. He could have, as the king of the gods at the time, chosen another god or goddess and said, you do it. But he didn't. He stepped forward and upheld it himself, knowing that he was betraying probably a very great love. Fenrir was not just a dog that he raised from puphood. He was sentient. We know that he could talk. He was probably a very good friend, not to mention, man's best friend. Tyr had to go through a lot of grief in being willing to do this sacrificial act himself. It's known that after the binding, Fenrir was removed it was another realm. I'm not recalling it at the moment, but Fenrir was brought to basically hell, where he was strung up and left to rot. He couldn't starve to death, so he just was hungry and thirsty and waiting, bound for all eternity until Ragnarok, the end of days. It's known Tyr would go and visit him to sit with him and relieve him of his loneliness, his hunger, his thirst. Even after all of this, Tyr maintained his love for Fenrir, and he had to have so much grief seeing what Fenrir was going through every day and being unable to stop it for fear of what Fenrir would do to everyone else. I think as we go forward, we can take the lessons of this tale and apply it to how we choose our leaders today. Do they have this sacrificial quality, this strength, the grief for doing what's right? If it comes easily, all of the horrible things that you have to do as a leader, then you're not a leader. If you have no regret, if the bad doesn't stack up in your conscience, you're not a leader. You're a taker. Selfish. Unworthy. You're just a good talker. We have to look at how we view our leaders and why, if they're really going to do the necessary things that the decision makers of the world ask of them, and if they're going to be willing to do it themselves, or if they're going to force it to be trickled down to someone else's hands.